Perfect. I'll start the way. So
Okay.
we should have people flying there now. Hi everyone, you're very welcome to our Reseeding and Clover webinar this evening. We have 3 great speakers this evening. We have Jan Mack and grass seed varieties, Rachel O'Leary on Reseeding, and James Humphreys on Clover. Just before we start, just to remind participants that there is a questions and answers tab at the bottom of the screen. So we're not going to take questions after each presentation. We'll just open the floor to questions at the very end. So I'll hand you over to our first speaker, Jan McNamara. Take it away there, Jan.
Gavin, Gavin, I'm not starting until there's more people in. Like, you're paying big money for me, and if you think I'm going to start up with only 4 people on arrived, no, I'm going to wait till at least there's 100, like, because it's the same money you're going to pay. So per person, at the moment, they are going to be paying about 15 euros each. But if we waited a small while, the cost per person would probably be dropping. Will I kick off, Gavin, or will I tell a joke? Oh, I could do a dance. Will I do a small bit of a...
I'd say kick away off, Jan, because we'd never afford you otherwise.
Yeah. I'd get rid of the speakers out of it. I was expecting a bigger introduction. Lads, I'm really here to run down on the basis of all the grass varieties, I suppose, we put together. I'm not going to go down through each variety, obviously. For as long as I've been around Bend and Co-op have got the Teagasc people involved in making up grass seed mixes. I suppose, look, it had 2 roles. One, we were very happy to be in there influencing what was being set locally. And 2, it cut down maybe the number of special mixes that were being made up by Teagasc advisors, because the differences between, you know, an existing grazing mix off of the abandoned catalogue, we'll say, and something special we make up would be very, very small. And it's just creating an awful lot of hassle for everyone. So it had 2 objectives, and we're delighted to be in it. At this stage, everything we're using is coming off of what you see there on the screen, the Department of Agriculture, the marine grass clover list. That has improved immensely in the last 10 or 15 years. I'd say go back 10 or 15 years ago, we were often using varieties that mightn't be on that yet, but were coming off the Northern Ireland list, or might even be coming off the Welsh list. At this stage, we are very, very reluctant to use anything that isn't used, you know, that isn't come off the department list and is trialled in Ireland. Because look at it. Look at what's it saying up there. That's 2 variety. So we'll say they sowed in 2020. They'll sow it another year, and they'll sow it in 2021. And then the results that are coming off it in 2021. There's that amount of data in there on each particular variety. Probably a word of warning there. Sure, part of tonight's job is a little bit of advertising of what varieties are out there, as well as, more important, about how to get reseeding with Rachel next, and James Humphreys, in fairness, the main speaker tonight, on where we're going on Clover. And while I'm talking on Clover, and I'm going around the place a little bit here, but while we're talking on Clover, I'd say James will nearly say the same thing. Lads, Clover isn't easy, but we have to crack Clover. The department are saying they'll have it for next year, which means the year after. They're going to have an effective way where they're going to control the amount of bag nitrogen you can buy, whether that's your PPSN number or your herd number or something. They're going to do it the same as they did sprays. And if we are able to understand how to run Clover at farm level, we are going to take a drop in the amount of grass you're producing. You have 2 choices at that stage. You drop your stock and money, less output, or you buy in more feed, which is going to cost money. So unfortunately, we have to start learning how to crack Clover and know more about it at farm level before that actual bag nitrogen restriction comes on us. Sorry, I drifted off here. If you're not coming off of that list, beware, because unfortunately there's still a fair amount of grass seeds that is not. It might be cheap seed that's gone off the list. Maybe it's still available in Europe, and it's easy enough to put together a bag of cheap grass seed. You're only reseeding maybe once in 10 years, maybe longer. It ain't worth penny pinching on a small bit of the overall cost. On top of the recommended list, then Teagasc are producing PPI, Pasture Production Index, where they're taking a lot of the information actually that's coming from the department, and then they're adding on another little bit of value as well. So the bits that are coming from the department, is the spring growth, the summer growth, and the autumn growth, basically measured much the same as some people are measuring grass out there. They put, like the plots you see there on the left, they come in and they cut them at various times. So it's a mowing regime. It's not a grazing regime. It's simulated grazing, but there's no cows trampling on it. There's no cows dunging on it. The quality test is they take those grass samples when they take the cuttings, and it goes through a lab. And ultimately, they're testing really here for DMD. The quality of the grass is what they're mainly doing. And the differences will be small enough, but those differences are significant enough. And Rachel is going to be touching on that at some stage, the difference between old grasses and new grasses. So an old grass, it will be lower quality, or can be a lower quality, not necessarily wheat grasses would be lower quality. So the cow needs to eat more of it, but won't be as inclined to eat as much of it. High quality grass, they want to eat it, so they're taking more in. And on top of that, each time they're taking it in, they're taking in higher quality material. The other thing is measured the yield. So distinct from the grazing, where they're doing, I think, 8 cuts a year, they call it simulated grazing. Silage is where they're taking 3 cuts a year, so they're going for bigger yields. And then they have a persistency score. Now, most of the time, the difference between persistency is very, very small. I think there's only one grass at the minute, which is a bit lower than the rest of them on persistency. How they measure persistency, they see how dense the sward is from year to year. And this, the last one on it, utilization, is the first year it's on it. It's one we're getting our heads around a little bit, I suppose, and we're starting to use it. Excited about it because still doing varieties, all the varieties that are on the list inside in whatever it is, a 5-acre or a 10-acre paddock. You let your herd of cows into it. They measured the height of the grass that was on each of the paddocks or each of the plots before the cows come in. When it's assessed that the field is grazed out, they go back in and measure the height. The particular grasses cows like, they will take them to the floor without being forced on. They will get a high utilization score. The particular grasses, or the grasses they don't particularly like to graze out, they will get a low utilization score. Now, go back to the point about how much they eat. What you'd ideally like is a high utilization score because they like it, and then high quality. Now, so far we're seeing there isn't a great connection between grasses they really like to eat and quality. It is with some of them, but some of the lower quality grasses, now the differences are small, some of the lower quality grasses, they really like to eat them. And some of the higher quality grasses, quality is measured in a lab, they don't like to eat them. So the utilization is something we're starting to use when you'll see in the tables in a minute where it shows up, and you'll see in the banded mixes where we're starting to use it. But it's a new trait, it's there this year, it's something we're excited about, because there's no point having a great grass if ultimately cows don't particularly like to graze it. So am I moving to the next? Sorry, lads. Next one, did it? There's a little lag here maybe now. My next slide is showing a little bit of trouble coming up. Sorry, Gavin, I'll just come back again. It wasn't showing the next one for some reason.
Yeah, no worries.
Can you see the next slide?
I can see that, John, yeah.
Yeah, with late tetraploids on it.
Yeah.
No. Okay, because yeah, it's not coming. Okay, it's not coming across. So okay, so I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on these because this is just an array of numbers. You can get it down off the department website, or I'm sure Rachel has it or Gavin has it if anyone particularly wants to go through. So I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on it, but we'll just follow Abergane, I suppose, which is a variety probably in some of the mixes, which is the second one there on the line. If we follow that across, it's very high up in the PPI. So the PPI is like the overall EBI index. It's adding all these together. But if you look at Abergane, it's okay in spring, but it's not the greatest in spring growth. And these are money figures. So what they do is they take the yields and a bit like the EBI, they convert them into money. So grass at least double what it's worth in summer, because grass in spring can directly replace meal and silage. Grass in summer, really, if you have extra grass in summer, it's generally been taken out for silage, so not as valuable. And grass in the autumn equally is very valuable again, because it's going to replace meal or silage. So taking those values, taking that principle, they're valuing what the like of Abergain is doing in spring. So in spring, not hectic. In summer, super. In autumn, super. In quality, super. Reasonable for silage. No problem with persistency, and 3 stars. So cows are happy eating it. Yes, there's ones there that are 5 stars, but equally there's, say, the grass below it in the short. Well, sorry, that's unfair. The grass, say, go down to Aber Plentiful, which is 2 stars. They prefer eating Abergain than Aber Plentiful. In fairness, Nashoto and Glenfield are new varieties on the list, and there isn't the utilization figures in it yet. I'll just move on to the next one, which should be late diploids. Can you see it, Gavin?
Yeah, John, you're fine there, yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, it's just, there's a lag here and it coming up. I actually sent my wife out to go walking to get her off the bloody internet, but maybe she snuck back in since I started talking, and is talking to her vast array of people on social media. I think she has 15 followers on Twitter, and she's delighted with herself. She might be causing a problem with my internet. Here are the late diploids. And as you'll see when we get to banded mixes in a minute, you are trying to mix tetraploids and diploids. Some people would say we're maybe too conservative. We should be driving the tetraploid percentages up. Tetraploids, they like eating them. They're more upright, but they're not as dense on the ground. So they're a bit more maybe prone to poaching. Now, we're starting to get maybe braver about putting in more tetraploids, because what people will say to you about poaching, if cows like to eat the grass, they stick their head down and they eat it. You take them off it then if it's wet weather, say in spring, on off grazing, and at other times of the year it's not an issue because ground is better. If you have diploids that they don't particularly like to eat, they're doing a lot of walking around, and in the walking around, even though it's denser grass underfoot, that's when they're doing the damage. So in general, mixes are increasing in tetraploids. Some farmers are looking for complete tetraploid mixes. Those are the late diploids there. You'll see Aber Choice, that shows up in some of the banded mixes. You'll see Drumbo, again, shows up in some of the banded mixes. And without going through the exact figures, maybe when we're explaining it in a minute, why we put particular things, we can do that. Same here with intermediates. Traditionally, an intermediate was counted as a sort of a silage grass. When we started making up grass seed mixes first, a grazing mix would be 1/3 intermediate at maximum and 2/3 lates, and a silage would be the opposite way around, to be 2/3 intermediates for your cut the 20th of May on, and there was less probably silage ground being grazed before cutting at that stage, and it was more upright, so the intermediate stayed upright. That distinction has sort of fudged over the years, and now effectively anything that is heading after the 31st of May is counted a late, and anything that's heading before the 31st of May, like you're looking at here, is counted an intermediate. So the growth habit may be very, very similar between an intermediate and a late. In other words, they both could be what they call prostrate, low, rather than particularly high. I'll move on to maybe the rationale behind some of the mixes. So that's abandoned grass seed and intensive silage is the first one. So when we're putting together a grass seed mix, we want to minimize the number of grasses in it to 3 or 4 grasses. There's no advantage in having a big run of grasses in there, but you would like at least 2, 3, 4 grasses for 2 things. It's a bit like those that are into breeding that are using genomic bulls. You're spreading your risk. If the like of Grace Hill happens to get hit with some grass disease, because grass is only a cereal too, or a cereal is only a grass, and you have all Grace Hill in there, you're a bit more susceptible. Remember a number of years ago, we got a run of getting rust on particular grasses in August, September. no real problem to the grass, but cows didn't particularly like to eat it, and we didn't particularly like maybe all that fungus getting into cows' rumens, but you had to graze through it. So you do like to spread it around. So you're looking at the quality aspect of the varieties for silage, and particularly the silage, because they're measuring both silage yield and quality. So these grasses in here would all be good on that. And on top of that, then you're trying to keep the head and dates close together. This is phenomenally close. I would be happy even if they went out further. If I had from the 28th of May right out to say the 10th of June, I'd accept it if I had to. But here they're good. 29th of May out to the 4th of June. They're good. So those are the heading dates if they weren't grazed. If you graze in spring, you're going to delay those heading dates slightly if you're, you know, and dependent on the year, obviously. So heading dates are good. Silage, Rachel will be touching on it later as regards if you're doing a reseed and you get lots of grazings in spring, each grazing is encouraging the grass to tiller, and you'll get more tillering done up to the 1st of June each year than from the 1st of June to the end of the year. Silage, because it won't be getting grazed as much, won't tiller as much. So we are inclined to keep the tetraploid percentage down in silage mixes, because they're already, tetraploids are a bit more open than the diploid, and if you put too much tetraploid in there, your whole sward might get a bit too open. The only problem with open is it's allowing weeds to come in. It's leaving more opportunity, particularly for docks. So 12 kilos to the bag is the standard. There's lots of people out there selling grass seeds at less than 12 kilos to the bag. Buy your grass seed or price your grass seed per kilo, not per bag. Most people would be probably adding an extra bag in 5 in spring, and the later you go in the autumn, maybe a bag in 4, just to put a little bit more grass seed in there. The next one is the abandoned grazing mix, and Gavin, if you can't see it again, flag it up to me at some stage, but I'll take it we can see it. Aberclyde, we had to get it in this year. Aberclyde is the top bull on the pasture production index at 221, I think, or 220. I can go back and check in a minute. So Aberclyde had to get in there. High for quality, good utilization, 4 stars. So we're struggling to find anything wrong with Aberclyde. Now, maybe in a year or two, something will surpass it, we hope. So Aberclyde went in heavy there. Abergain, another tetraploid around the while in grasses, in mixes before, a quality of 52, 3-star utilization. Drumbo, really our tried and trusted sort of bottom grass, you know, only in the 2 kilos. We're starting to drift away from it a bit because its utilization is lower than what we'd like, and it's lower than the other 2 grasses there. We still feel it has a role to go in there because it has been in grasses for a long time. We don't have any negative feedback on as regards people grazing it out, but it is showing a bit weaker in utilization. And then Aberchoice, the top, isn't it? Yeah, the top diploid grass in their high quality, and again with a 2-star for utilization. Now note, we've driven up the percentage tetraploid here because it's a grazing mix, and the grazing alone, we'll keep it tillered and keep it dense. So 58% tetraploid. And I think we have we, I think I've one more, have I? Yeah, I have. I've had a cut and graze. Now, I'm not sure where this fits in exactly, because if someone said to me, I'm going to take a 1-cut silage, this is perfect for a 1-cut silage. But equally, the intensive grazing is perfect for a 1-cut silage. If you're definitely going to take 2-cut silage, go with your intensive silage mix, because it is the grasses are better lined up and they have more of a growth habit that will suit, you know, 2 cuts of silage or 3 cuts of silage. This is probably similar enough to your intensive grazing, but if you're wary of tetraploid, this is the biggest differentiation between this and the intensive grazing. It's got only 42% tetraploid as distinct from 58% in the intensive grazing. Dunluce, there's a good bit of Dunluce above in Shinnock, and they like grazing it. It's one of the paddocks, you know, that there's 2 paddocks there with a high percentage of Dunluce, and it fits with the utilization score there of 4 stars. Ballyvoy is a new diploid coming on stream. worth trying, reasonable on quality. We're not quite sure where it's sitting at the moment in utilisation. And again, our Aber choice that was used a minute ago. So Gavin, I'm nearly finished. Just one final piece, because it might be of interest, and it will when we get to James. As most of you are aware, Shinnock last year set what we call a multi-species paddock above. Now really, it's a grass and clover paddock. Really, that's what it is. But there's half of it is perennial ryegrass, some of the grasses we've just mentioned. There's 3 kilos then of a mix of red and white clover. And I'd say James will be mentioning something about red clover. In theory, I didn't like it going in. It has gone in, it has done a job. It might be one of the reasons why that paddock only got 40 units. I'm sorry now, people, for going back to this. Rachel, you might do the maths and have it when you come on. 40 units per acre. That's whatever it is. That's about 60 kilos per hectare of nitrogen last year from the 19th of May on. And half of that went in the reseeding. It stood its own against all the other paddocks, bar 4. So it stood its own. It did the same. It produced the same from the 1st of June to the end of the year as all the other paddocks. Chicory is in there because it's very deep rooted, and it may have some role to play as regards nitrogen that gets washed down the soil, away from the grassroots, that maybe chicory can get at it equally. Maybe it's able to hold the soil structure well by keeping it open. The thinking behind plantain, it encourages cows to urinate more often. There's a groovy scientific name for that, but I'm not sure what it is. The benefit of that is when a cow's urine is the equivalent of something like 600 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So when you put that down on one spot, all her urine, for the last 4 hours, that's a big concentration of nitrogen. Plantain encourages, it's a diuretic, I think is the word for it. It's a bit like most of you going to the pub, you have to go in and out to the toilet a little bit more often. It has the same effect. If you take on a lot of liquid, it'll encourage you to get rid of it on a regular basis. So by the cow urinating more regularly, the concentration of urine is less. To me, we're trying it. No cow died on it. They like to eat it. They graze it to the floor every time. The real research on this will be coming out of Johnstown Castle and Curtin's Farm. Weave it in there. It did a good job. If nothing else, even if the chicory and the plantain die out, it is the best field of clover we've ever set. Now, part of it is there's more clover gone in, and part of it is more open because of the chicory and plantain. Kevin and we are so happy with this that there's 2 more paddocks of it gone in again this year. We're on a project of increasing the amount of clover on the farm, going to James Humphreys Road of, we know we're going to get restricted to nitrogen somewhere in the future, and let's learn how to do it. Gavin, I'd say I've ran over, but that's me. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Just to remind anybody who's joined there, we're going to open, there's a couple of questions coming through, but we'll open the floor to questions after the 3 presentations there. So I might just hand over to Rachel. You might stop sharing your screen there, John, and we can get Rachel to share hers.
Thanks, Gavin. Can you see that there?
Yeah, perfect.
And you can just see the one side, yeah?
No.
No.
No, we're
That's all right.
Just
You're just all right. Just the next side is bigger, but sure.
I think you see this.
We can work away that, Rachel.
But you see display settings up on top, at the top of your screen. No. When you were on the last screen, the display settings up there. The last screen. Go back to the screen you were on. See display settings on the top. Yeah.
Super.
There you go. Perfect.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much, Gavin. My name is Rachel O'Leary. I'm the dairy advisor there in the local Bandon area. I'm working out of the Clonakilty office. I suppose some of you might know me, some of you might not know me. I'm local enough to the Bandon area, I suppose, not too far away. We're dairying ourselves at home, and before I joined Teagasc, I was working with Lisvard Co-op. So
can we get a look at you for 1 minute?
I look the same as my picture, so my internet's a bit shaky here, so I'd be afraid if I put on the video, it might cut out. So
Okay.
I might just leave it like that for a minute, just while I'm speaking.
Perfect.
I suppose following on from John, I'm just going to cover a few different things about reseeding. Look, we're coming into kind of late spring there now, but it's the perfect time to start reseeding if you're considering reseeding this year. And I might just go through a couple of the benefits there and the timing of the reseeding, a bit on soil fertility and the establishment methods, and then the post-sowing care. So I suppose just first of all on the benefits of reseeding, just to remind you all, the first one, I suppose, is the increase in dry matter yield. Look, that's a fantastic one, and there's plenty of studies out there to show that there's a large increase in the dry matter grown even in early spring up for the grazing season up till May and even the start of June. You know, there's studies there that show that you grow an extra 2 ton of dry matter, which is a fantastic benefit to reseeding part of your grazing ground in any given spring. I suppose the increased seasonal growth explains itself. Look, the more growth that you're going to have in spring and summer, you'll get more grazings and a better response from the ground. With that, you'll have an improved increase to the nitrogen fertilizer that you spread. There's studies there to show that you'll have a 25% increase in the nitrogen fertilizer that you spread, which, you know, kind of goes on to point number 4 there, where you'll have better regrowth and a better crop and better quality, a better quality grass. And look, any improve in the response to nitrogen is going to benefit you in many other areas, even let alone the, you know, your pocket and reducing stuff coming in the farm gate. So the better regrowth there, I suppose. Look, after you're grazing it down and you're grazing it down tight, you can see the difference in the regrowth from reseeded grass to an old pasture. The regrowth is far superior and much better quality. Going on to the improved quality then of the reseeded grass, I suppose, look, the dry matter digestibility is far superior, and with then therefore the cows will, you know, they'll have a much higher intake, which in turn will give you a much better output of the cow. And I suppose you can relate that back then to, you know, in the winter time, you know, when they're eating silage, you'll see that they're eating more of it, but they're filling more in it, which, you know, that will reduce, you know, the bought-in feed, you know, coming in the parlour. I suppose fellas will tell you that they think that they see a better response from feeding meal in the winter time and stuff, but you have to look at, you know, the kind of silage that they're feeding. And if you're feeding poor quality silage, they're not eating it for a reason, you know. It's not appealing to them, it's poor quality, it's not doing anything for them, so therefore they're going to prefer the higher energy feed that you're giving them inside in the parlour, you know, or however you'd feed it. So look, that's a massive there, and you're going to be saving big time by not bringing in extra feed coming in through the farm gate, you know. I suppose the increased animal performance there, as you said, with the increased quality, like the cows are going to be, you know, grazing through, and they'll be getting a higher energy and a higher crude protein coming from this reseeded ground, and therefore you'll see the results there in your co-op performances. So the increased farm profit, look, I think just from going through all them, you'll be bringing less in from outside in terms of concentrate feeding and all that, and you'll be getting more performance from the same ground that you already had, but just by reseeding and introducing better quality grass on your own grazing platform, you'll see there that you're reducing your outputs and increasing the profit coming into the farm. I suppose the timing of reseeding, look, just talking today, we're talking about spring reseeding and the benefits that outweigh the spring reseeding over the autumn reseeding. Look, we're talking about we're coming into late spring now with coming towards the end of April, but now is the optimal time for if you're considering reseeding. I suppose you can keep going now until the May, but you know, it's down to the individual then if you're considering going any later than May, really, you know, because June and July, you know, you'd be, unless you know your ground very well, you know, the conditions wouldn't be optimal for reseeding. I suppose just for going for now, we have the improved temperatures, as I know, look, they can be variable at times, but As a whole, the temperatures are much better now going through and going forward. Look, the temperatures are on the increase. We've had a couple of cold nights, but they've turned around now again. And with improved temperatures, you're giving the reseed more of a chance, you know, and the improved ground conditions then as well. I suppose if you think about it, when you're putting down that tiny little seed into the ground, like they're the optimal conditions, the best conditions you can in the springtime as opposed to the winter time. Look, they're vulnerable for less time inside in the ground, and you know they have better conditions to establish and to thrive, you know. So that goes out saying then with the improved temperatures, look, the longer day lengths there that we're getting, the evenings you can see yourselves are brighter now until 9:30 nearly, and like with the more sunlight is getting, that aids the reseeding, you know, and the conditions for it to thrive. I suppose the opportunity then for the weed control, look, that's something that people need to, you know, you can't just set your seed and close the gate and come back to it in 2 months' time and expect to graze it without, you know, having a good plan in place to control the weeds there. I suppose you can, you know, the conditions be right for going in with your post-emergent sprays and walking the ground and seeing what's coming up and establish, you know, between the pests and the weeds and the different things, you know, you'd be able to see them and you'd be able to control them better in the springtime. A massive one there for reseeding it during springtime, I suppose, would be the opportunity for multiple grazings. Look, I suppose there's there's all these studies done in the research department in Teagasc, and you know, a day extra out in grass, you know, you always hear this figure as, you know, €2.70 a day extra for, you know, a profit towards the extra days that you get grazing. That's huge, like, you know, and as opposed to doing it in the autumn time, you know, that's half in the autumn time. So, you know, I suppose as well with the opportunities for grazing, you know, you might have a bit of ground out, you know, with the grazing. You might be saying you can't do without the ground. I suppose if you think about it, and maybe the year that's in it, it might be a good opportunity for you to, you know, buy in silage or buy in another, you know, a cheaper feed. Whereas doing it in the autumn, if you think about it, you're buying in concentrate, which is far more expensive, and it's going to totally make the reseeding far more expensive. But why is buying in silage? And you know, I suppose this time of year there as far as I'm aware, there is feeding out there to be got, so it might be an opportunity to think of it that way, you know, instead of buying in ration in the autumn time. I suppose just the last one, the early summer drought, as I was mentioned on at the start there, kind of now when coming into May is an optimal time for reseeding. I suppose when I mentioned June or July, look, it's not great. I'd be waiting out then near to August time, you know, June and July, you could be hit with drought, or you could be hit with, you know, very dry conditions that just will make the reseeding, it won't thrive, and you won't have the output from it that you'd be looking for. So look, I'd be highly considering going in now in the next, you know, couple of weeks and getting in there early so that the grass can come back and that you'll start seeing the benefits from it. I suppose we'll just touch on soil fertility there. Look, I suppose there should be a lot more emphasis put on this, because look, soil fertility is the basis of the whole thing. You know, you might think that by going out, you mightn't see the grass growing, all this, you might just think, oh, it hasn't got enough, you know, nitrogen or phosphorus or any of this kind of thing, and you might go out with bagged stuff. But really, you should be looking at the fertility first and foremost, and working off the fertility with a plan then to, you know, what to put out in the grass. So if you see there, look, the low pH in grass, like you can get up to 1.5 tons, you know, and that's being like generous there. Like, you know, you can get much worse than that. So of tons of dry matter, of a loss in growth, which look, if you're only growing 9 or 10 tons, you can work that out yourself. Like you're losing a big opportunity there. And I suppose just the figures there with the indexes, if you know, as you all know, there's index 1 to 4. Like index 1 is the poorest and the least productive, and having a P index and of 1 will also give you a loss of 1.5 tons there of dry matter per hectare. The K index also, but that's even worse again. You know, you could be getting 1 up to 3 tons of dry matter loss there in your silage ground. So look, I suppose what I'm trying to say there is correcting the soil pH, you know, can have many more benefits than, you know, yes, of course, growing the dry matter, but also as well, you know, your efficiency and your profits also. So like having the correct pH, which is, you know, in and around the 6.3 is what you'd be targeting for grass ground. So look, if you can see there that having the correct soil pH will release 80 kgs more of nitrogen, you know, per hectare, more so than having your a lime deficiency in the soil. Having correct pH is going in with the correct amount of lime according to your soil sample results, and you know, they can once you understand your soil sample results, things can be rectified, you know. Having the correct pH again in the soil makes the P and K more available to the soil. And you know, I can't stress that and emphasize that enough. People think that, you know, for some reason it's not bought enough that, you know, sure, how can that happen, you know, but you know, really the results are there and the trials have been done that the P and the K that have been grown with the correct soil pH, you know, it's phenomenal. And I have a small graph there for you next that you'll be able to see that visually, you know. I suppose the increased efficiency of fertilizer is something as well. Look, as John said, it's going to come down the line soon enough with the fertilizer, and you know, they're already starting to get strict on it in places that, you know, they are going to be watching the amount of chemical fertilizer that farmers are buying. So I suppose if you can correct your soil fertility now and start working on it and start getting your pH right and your soil indexes right, then you know you will reduce your fertilizer usage, and your grass will grow much more better. So I suppose just moving on there, back onto the graph as I was saying about the lime, you can see here the index 1 through to 4. The first one there is 0.8 tons of dry matter grown that has no P and no lime, and it was at the lowest index. Okay, so I suppose moving up there, and if you were just applying lime, more P became available then to the soil. It unlocked the P. When you don't have lime and when you don't have your pH, as I said, then the P gets locked up and it can't utilize it. Therefore, the grass can't, you know, it can't be utilized within the soil. Then just going on to P only, just that you can see that it overcame some of the lack of the pH by applying more P. It did grow more grass because that's a short-term effect where it overcomes the deficiency there, you know. But if you can see there where the pH was corrected by applying the correct amount of lime and the correct amount of P, you know, over 17 tons of dry matter there was grown. And this has, you know, this is a trial that has been done, and it has been done on many different types of soil, many different types of ground. And you know, I suppose if you can see there, like it is far better to have your pH corrected in the soil. So I suppose just a small bit, which method is up to yourself, I suppose, really. Look, there has been a trial there, and it was examined each different type of method that's out there. They did between the ploughing there, you can see the disc and the one pass, the direct drilling. Look, they've tried all three of them, and they've tried more, I suppose, well, and it really found that there was a good job done with all of them. All of the ones had the same results. The control was the exact same. It was all old permanent pasture that they were reseeding, and the difference there that was shown was absolutely none. So the method, you know, fellas, we talk about which is better and which one will I go for, you know, it's up to yourself really, and which one works best for you. The increase in dry matter yield there over the control, you know, in the sowing year, there's the 2 ton there of the dry matter per hectare in the sowing year, you know. So as I said, I've mentioned the increase in dry matter over the control there anyway of the old permanent pasture and the benefits we went through them. I suppose we'll go on to some of the reasons why reseeds might struggle. Gavin, if I'm talking too fast or too slow, you can come in and interrupt there. I can't see the background, I can only see my slides. So I suppose just going on there, as I was saying about why do reseeds struggle and stuff. Look, the poor seed bed is the first thing. That's the first thing that you'd be doing. It's the first thing you'd be preparing for when you're going in reseeding. I suppose, you know, getting the right spray, the right, you know, cultivating the bed correctly. that all has a huge part to play in it for allowing the grass seed to come up and to thrive. Again, there, the low soil pH and the no lime. Look, I suppose this comes back to, you need to be soil sampling, you need to be, you know, getting your ground sampled. And really, you know, they say that it's every 5 years. You should really be going out as often as you can. I would be recommending every 2 to 3 years, you know, getting out there, sampling it. You know, these things change all the time with our higher stock levels now and more grazings. You know, we need to keep on top of this, on top of the lime and the pH, so that we can get the fertility status right inside in the soil bed. They're going on to that, the poor soil fertility. Look, that comes down to not utilising the P and K and all that as well. So the inadequate fertiliser. Look, it's kind of, I suppose, the old thinking, and the way that it's still recommended is the 3 bags of 10, 10, 20. With the inadequate fertiliser, people tend to go out with, you know, even 18, 6, 12, and you can go in with too much nitrogen when you're reseeding. You can always go in with nitrogen after, but it's vital when you're reseeding and to go in with the correct fertiliser, is to go in with the right P and K first, you know, and that's what will help the reseed come good. After that, then you can go in, you can top it up with the nitrogen and all that when it's starting to thrive. But at the start, you know, it's to get the P's and the K's right, you know, and you'll do that by having the lime spread, and then it will be taken up much better with the P's and K's. So look, the recommendation is still there. Look, some people say, you know, depending on soil sample results then as well, you know, 2 ton of 10, 10, 20, but 10, 10, 20 is still the recommendation that we'd be going out with. I suppose the timing, too early and too late, you know, look, going too early could get waterlogged, going too late, you know, you could be facing into drought and different things like that. It's all about the timing. I think, you know, the timing of this webinar here now tonight is very good for people to really get thinking about it and to get out there and to maybe consider going now in the next couple of weeks, because I think the timing and the conditions are optimal at the moment. Now, going back again, considering you all know your own ground, better than anyone else, so you make that call as well then yourselves. Look, no rolling and the plant pulling out and all this. I suppose the no rolling, like, you know, by rolling you are reducing the surface area around the paddock and around the field. So therefore, like, you're going to have less of a moisture loss, and then that will obviously help if, you know, if a dry spell came or anything like that. You know, all the water should stay within the soil and be taken up by the new reseed. I suppose the first grazing there at, you know, too high a cover or cutting it for silage without grazing it. Look, the you know yourselves, early on in the spring grazing, up until, as John was saying there, up until around the middle of June and stuff, grass will tiller and tiller until the more grazing it gets. So, you know, I suppose after about 6 weeks or so, or whenever the grass is established, you'll be going in, and when there's a small cover on it and it's well established all around, it's picking up well, you get in there and you get out of there as soon as you can. You get in there and you give it a good graze down and you get out, and then that will encourage more tillering and a more thicker growth and a better establishment of the grass seed. You know, tillering is what you want, and you're going to establish that tillering between now and we'll call it June. So I suppose they're coming to the end of my slides there now. I suppose really, you know, establishing paddocks and fields for reseeding, it's, you know, coming back to your pasture base there, where you can get a wealth of information on, you know, what paddocks are growing what, and, you know, you can input your fertilizer as well that you've been using on those paddocks, and that will give you a good idea as well of, you know, how much chemical fertilizer and what this ground is getting. And, you know, you might question of which paddocks, then you can identify the poorer ones, you know, and the poorer performing ones, and, you know, you can kind of really break down the individual paddocks by looking at them on pasture base. And I suppose, look, ones that are growing less grass, you know, you're going to bound to be reseeding those. Ones that have a high presence of weeds, you know, and that are really, you know, I suppose, you know, ones that have high established of weeds inside them. Ones that maybe, you know, got very badly poached, that look, got severely poached in early springtime, you might consider reseeding those. And then there's other things, I suppose, you might look at maybe silage fields, you know, a paddock that has grown less silage compared to previous years. And then I suppose small things like the regrowth after cutting and the response to nitrogen when you go out with it, you know. So I suppose, look, I'd be looking into all those kind of things. There's lots of different areas. Look, as I said, I suppose, Gavin, really, that's the end of my presentation. I know, look, when I was told I was to talk about reseeding can sometimes be a kind of a thing that people think, sure, we know that. It's fantastic to be reminded about these things and, you know, to get thinking about these things again, because, you know, you've had a busy spring now with calving and everything going on. So I highly recommend, you know, to maybe look at your figures and go out and, you know, walk the ground and have a look at your pasture base down, you know, all the covers that you've been putting in and stuff, and, you know, make your decision and have a look at the benefits that far outweigh everything else, you know. And I'd be recommending it. And as I said, I'm in the local office there. I'm in the local area advising in Bandon and around. And look, if there's anything else you want to know about it, then I'd be more than happy to help out at any stage. You can get me in the Clonakilty office there down in Dara. You can ring the office and you'll get through. And Gavin can pass on my information if there's anything that you'd want to query after. So listen, I suppose I'll just thank you very much for your attention. And I suppose in these times, I want to thank Gavin and Bandon Guac for organising it, because I suppose, look, it's still great to connect with as many farmers as possible in these times, you know, and to try and get as much information out there as possible. So I think it is, we'll try and achieve that for as long as we have to anyway. And please God, we'll get out on farm and out to public meetings as soon as possible. So that's for me, Gavin. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. There's a couple of questions coming through there. Look, we'll open the floor at the end again and we can get those answered. I might just hand over to James there. If you could stop sharing the screen there, Rachel, and James, you can start, please.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. You can see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So good evening, everybody. I was asked to talk about Clover and the work that we're doing in Solihead. And I suppose what I'm going to start by doing is saying why we're doing the work as much as how we're doing it. And to put it in context, as John said earlier on, there is pressure to reduce nitrogen fertilizer use. We see the Green Deal, even beyond the Green Deal, the UN are looking at there's targets there to reduce nitrogen fertilizer. And when I started in Teagasc, it's nearly 30 years ago now, it wouldn't have been uncommon to recommend, say, 300 units per acre or almost 400 kilos per hectare for a stocking rate of a cow to the acre. And I was asked the question recently, you know, what's possible? How low can we go in terms of nitrogen fertilizer use? And I said that it's probably possible that we can go to zero, which is a very controversial statement. Of course, I work in research, and part of our job is to look ahead and to try things out, see what's possible. So we've been running a system now at Solihead for the last couple of years with no nitrogen. And kind of what I'm going to go through is the thought processes first that brought us there, because as John also said, Clover isn't as easy to manage as fertilizer nitrogen. Fertilizer nitrogen is a very easy system to run, very efficient, very cost effective in terms of producing cheap milk, and we're very competitive internationally because of that. So we have to be very careful about moving away from that type of system, which has worked very well for us. So to start, this shows greenhouse gas emissions per capita or per person in different European countries. And you see one country here sticks out in terms of the proportion coming from agriculture, and that's us here in Ireland. And this graph shows us two things that are important. Number one, on a European level, we have very high emissions per capita. We're one of the highest. And we also have exceptionally high emissions from agriculture, which is problematical from our perspective when we're dealing with agriculture. And if we didn't have agriculture, for example, such a high proportion coming from agriculture, we'd be on a different scale compared to our neighbours. Now, these are European countries. If you look at it internationally, emissions per capita in European countries are relatively high. So on a global scale, our emissions here from this country are very high. And of course, we have a responsibility in that regard. So in Ireland, it's around 13.2 tonnes per person. Denmark, which also has a relatively high proportion, similar country, similar size, it's 8.9. In the UK, 7.5, almost half of us. And in Sweden, then you see 5.4, and you say, what are the Swedes doing to have such low emissions? And I don't know the answer to that, because, but really puts the thing in context. The second aspect of this then is looking at emission reduction targets, and there are reduction targets for each country. And if we set our baseline here as 100% in 2005, and we look at how countries have performed in terms of achieving a 20% reduction by 2020, which is coming down to this level, we can see that some countries have exceeded that. Our near neighbours, the UK, have got down to 70%, and that's driven by a change in their energy generation away from coal and oil towards more wind and nuclear. And we can see Ireland, how we're performing on the scale of things. We're about 2/3 of the way down the line. Some countries have actually increased their emissions there. Poland, they've recently commissioned a new coal burning station because coal is very important to them. But it puts it in context. And again, there's a challenge there for us here in Ireland. So it's a major global challenge. It's said that this is the challenge of the next generation, or the coming generation. In my time, when I was in school and back in university, the big challenge at that stage was feeding the global population. And after World War II, very rapid increase in the global population. When I was born back in the late 60s, there was around 3.5 billion people on the planet. Now there's almost 8 billion people. So a massive increase. It's more than doubled in my lifetime. If you take my mother, who was born back in the 30s, it's more than tripled in her lifetime. And that's a startling thing when you think about this huge increase in population. Now, we had a famine in this country, as everybody knows, 170 years ago, but famine was widespread in the world back in the 50s and the 60s. There's been a really big change in the world in terms of food production, and you're far more likely nowadays, right across the world, not just in Ireland, but right across the world, to die from eating too much than not having enough to eat. So there's been a very big change in the global food production system. And if we look at, say, agricultural land, it's not really that more land is being brought into production. The amount of land under agricultural production more or less peaked out in the 50s, or it plateaued. There is some more land being brought into production, particularly in South Asia, maybe in South America. But there's also land being taken out of production for infrastructure and other things. So more land doesn't really explain it, and there isn't really any more land to bring into production, or any huge amount of additional land to bring into production. So how do we explain the change in the food system? And really it's down to fertilizer, and nitrogen fertilizer in particular. And what this graph here shows the relationship between world population and global nitrogen fertilizer use, and you can see there's a very close relationship between the two. And really, nitrogen fertilizer, which really only came on stream since the 60s and 70s, has made a massive difference to world population, and you can think about different things like vaccines, better healthcare, better sanitation. And what's often overlooked is the impact that nitrogen fertilizer has had. And it goes back to this Haber-Bosch process. It was invented in the 1890s. And as I said, it really didn't come into big use until after World War II. And people have worked out or estimated that we've already well exceeded the capacity of the planet to produce enough food for everybody that's on it at the moment without the use of fertilizers. And really we'd need a planet and a half, or around, or another way of saying that is around half the people on the planet at the present time are there because of the use of fertilizers. So it's a very important input in terms of our global food production. This shows fertilizer use in Ireland since 1930, and there was very little fertilizer nitrogen used prior to World War II, as I said already. And people talk about the Green Revolution in Asia and other parts of the world. We also had our Green Revolution here in Europe and in Ireland. And the situation in Ireland was after, say, during World War II. And part of the reason World War II was fought was because in Germany and Japan, people were concerned about the capacity to feed their own populations, and they wanted to expand the land under their control so that they could produce more food for their own populations. And during the war, the Germans paid, say, French, Dutch, and German or Belgian farmers to produce more food, and the British as well paid their own farmers to produce more food. But if we take the original 6 countries of the EU or the EEC, that was the basis for the cap payments, or the cap payments evolved from that, because there was a real food security problem or real food scarcity in Europe after World War II. We joined the EEC then in 1972, and it was a time of very rapid development in Irish agriculture. Very big increase in nitrogen fertilizer use during that period. We became full members in 1979. The milk quota then, this payment system was working very effectively, created Butter Mountain. Milk quota was introduced in 1984. We see a kind of a falling off in the increase, in the rapid increase in fertilizer nitrogen use during the following period, which is known as the McSharry years, when there were still payments there for beef and increasing beef and sheep production. And people will remember the 1 punch and the double punch bullocks at that stage. Then Fischler came into power and introduced the decoupling of payments from production in the late 90s. And we had the REP scheme, the Rural Environmental Protection Scheme, and this process of extensification, which brought about a fairly substantial reduction in fertilizer nitrogen use, which coincided with lower output. Now we've entered the current period where we're seeing, again, an increase in fertilizer nitrogen use, mainly driven, I suppose, by the expansion of the dairy herd, the national dairy herd, and that's a matter that's causing concern for environmentalists. And of course, the next cap, or the next, which will be rolled out over the next few years, includes the Green Deal. And within the Green Deal, there's a target to reduce nitrogen fertilizer use, among other things, pesticides, but fertilizer use by 20%, not only in Ireland, but also in the EU. And as I was saying at the beginning, there's also UN targets to reduce nitrogen fertilizer use globally because of the problems with it, or the environmental impacts. So that's part of it. The other big challenge is the increase in cow numbers nationally, the increase in milk output. We could see following the quota, a big increase in milk output. Of course, that's has been a big boon for rural communities. It's really generating a good business in rural areas, which is very important. It's helped us to maintain exports and increase exports and maintain exports during this COVID crisis, which of course our economy is performing very well under very difficult circumstances. But it also has an impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And if we take it that this shows greenhouse gas emissions from dairy farms, national emissions around 60 million tons. And you can see back prior to the abolition of the quota, emissions from dairy farms account for around 10% of national emissions. That's now after increasing to 15%, which kind of puts dairy farming in the spotlight, as you're well aware. And there's been a lot of quite negative publicity about that over the last couple of years. So what's predicted to happen in the future? It's very hard to know, but an expansion in dairy production is predicted. And this will lead to some increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Maybe not as much, because we expect efficiencies to lower emissions. So it's very difficult to know what's going to happen in terms of, if you look at the cost of dairy stock at the moment, you'd be fairly that there's probably this increase could go on very strongly. And then you have things like what's happening in Glanbia, which is tending maybe to put a damper on the increase. But there's a big challenge around that question, and it also impacts on what will happen in other sectors, like say number of suckler cows, how methane is going to be accounted for in the future, this GWP star or global warming potential, using a different global warming potential and maybe forestry, but all of these areas. So it's very, very difficult to know what's going to happen in the future. So what can we do to lower emissions? Because that is a challenge. We continue to increase, which I think is very important for the economy, increase our dairy sector. What can we do to lower our emissions? And a key one is improving soil fertility. And I suppose this question goes back to decoupling this increase in cow numbers from emissions. And that means more efficiency, lower emissions per litre of milk, even though numbers are still going up. But first thing we need to do and is improve soil fertility, and it is a problem. Lime P and K status. That's the first step. You can also use protected urea, which will lower emissions, and also the use of red and white clover. And really, when we're applying fertilizer, we get ammonia emissions, we get nitrous oxide emissions from the fertilizer. If we replace that with clover, we completely reduce those emissions. And I'll try to put some figures on that at the moment, because as you probably know, you've these nodules that grow on the roots of clover, red and white clover. They take atmospheric nitrogen, convert it into plant available form in the same, not by the same process, but in a similar process to the Haber-Bosch process that I talked about earlier. Other things we can do is improve the EBI. We're trialing Sexemen in solid at the moment. We're happy with it. It's working reasonably well. Also low emission slurry spreading, maybe in the future covered slurry storage. So if we put some figures on that, and we've been running this system in Salahead, or these different systems. And if we start with this first system, it's kind of our control, our standard system. There's no clover. We're using splash plate slurry application, using 280 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. And that's applied as urea in cans. So this would be a pretty standard system based on we'll say the old Moore Park blueprint. Let's give you some emissions of around just less than a litre per milk, which is quite good. When you look at it nationally, it's around 1.15 on average. But we've very high EBI here at Salahead, and we run a very tight ship. If we move on to the second system here, again, no clover. We replace the splash plate with low emission slurry spreading. Because we're using less, we can get more efficient use of the nitrogen in the slurry, and we see this working very well. We can cut our nitrogen fertilizer use back to 250, maintain the same output, and in this case, only applied as protected urea. That will give us around 9% reduction in emissions. Half of those reductions are coming from around 5% coming from the lower nitrogen fertilizer use, and the other 4% coming from the protected urea. And that's a system that can be very easily adopted. It just means using protected urea if you can get your hands on it, rather than can of urea. The next system then is a clover-based system. Again, using low emission slurry spreading, halving the nitrogen fertilizer use to 125, and again only protected urea. That'll cut the emissions by 18%. So we were looking at this from our point of view, saying how far can we go, or how low can we go, and then we pushed on to this this final system here, which is only using clover and low emission slurry spreading. So we're not applying any fertilizer to this system. Let's give you a 25% or 26% reduction compared to the control, around a 35% reduction in emissions compared to the national average. So they're the kind of carbon footprints per litre of milk that we're getting, compared to, say, 1.15, which is the national average. When we look at it from the point of view of ammonia, we also see that we get even greater emission reductions from an ammonia emissions point of view, and there's also regulations governing ammonia emissions, and these are the real drivers in terms of a lot of the talk to reduce emissions from agriculture. You know, the simple thing to do is say just put a cap on numbers or cut numbers. If we can maintain output with much lower nitrogen fertilizer use. We're substantially cutting emissions, and that's something that really should be the first step, rather than tackling numbers. And really we should be trying to find ways to expand the national herd rather than put a cap on production. So this is the kind of system that's currently been recommended by Teagasc, a clover-based system with half the fertilizer used and only using protected urea. Now, if we take the situation in Salahead, or because it's fine thing to talk about different systems that we run, but if we look at the farm overall, going back to pre-quota, back to 2011 to 2013, we'd around half the farm under clover at that stage for experimental reasons. We'd around 90 cows on the farm, 130 acre farm, stocking rate 2.1, using 195 kilos of nitrogen overall. It's the milk production in terms of kilos of milk solids, carbon footprint per hectare, and the carbon footprint per litre of milk. And these are two different metrics. And often it's possible to improve your carbon footprint per litre, but not necessarily improve your carbon footprint per hectare, because you're increasing production, as you can see here. So then we had a meeting. The farm is owned by Tip Co-op. We had a meeting with the board, and what they said to us, they wanted us to increase milk output from the farm by 50% after the abolition of quota. So we worked on setting that about. 2016, the contract reared out the heifers, and we increased up the cow numbers. 2.39 in 2016, using 280 kilos nitrogen fertilizer over the entire farm. We increased our milk sales by 50%, and you can see the impact on the carbon footprint per hectare and per litre. As we're driving up production, we're also driving up our emissions and also our ammonia emissions. And then in 2017, we started the current work, which was looking at how do we bring about a reduction in emissions. And we set ourselves the target of getting back to where we started in terms of emissions per hectare. So by implementing the different type of systems that I've been talking about, progressive reduction in nitrogen fertilizer use down to 104 kilos per hectare across the entire farm, stocking rate of 2.5 cows per hectare, it's cows to the acre, and we're down to maintain milk output with a good year in 2020, down to 8.8, which is still higher than where we started. Our emissions per litre of 0.78, which is excellent, and also reductions in ammonia, which brings us on to the zero nitrogen system, which is our target for the future. Taking out nitrogen fertilizer altogether, that'll bring us down, maybe not being able to maintain more or less the same milk output as previously, but we'll get us lower emissions per hectare, lower emissions per litre, and substantially lower ammonia emissions as well. So that's really the direction of travel at Salahead, which I hope explains why we're using this Clover system. So the rationale for it is to maximize milk output while lowering emissions. 70% of the emissions from a farm, and I haven't gone into this, but 70% of the emissions are livestock related. So when you go onto a farm, you have your herd of cows, you have your replacements. Most of the emissions are coming from the herd in terms of methane, and also from the replacements. And the things you can do, of course, improve EBI, try to improve the lifetime production per cow, reduce the replacement rate. But it's very hard to bring about a big reduction in those elements as things stand, because you need cows to produce milk and you need heifers to replace those cows. So it's very hard to change that. And of course, when you have cows and heifers, you have excreta. The really option, or the first option, in my opinion, is to tackle the nitrogen fertilizer, and we can reduce our emissions. Around 20% of our emissions are from fertilizer nitrogen, so we've targeted that along with some of the emissions from excreta and also improving efficiency. And the rationale then for it is that I've explained, same greenhouse gas emissions from the farm as pre-quota, with a 50% increase in milk output from the farm, which is in line with national objectives. So that I hope explains why we're looking at that. So now the next part then is just to go on to talk about managing clover swards. The key to having clover is to get high nitrogen fixation, and the key to having high nitrogen fixation is to have a lot of clover in the sward. as you can see here, and this is based on work that it's more than 10 years old now. And really the focus of our work in recent times is to push our production, or push the level of nitrogen fixation we're getting from the farm up into this region, 200, 250 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. And that's something that we're achieving. This is another that shows the same thing from another point of view. It's based on some work from Moore Park, where you have grass only swards in blue here receiving different rates of nitrogen fertilizer, and also grass clover swards receiving the same rates of fertilizer. And what you can see here is on the grass clover swards, across the range of different fertilizer nitrogen input, you're getting more or less the same production. So if you take the work in Clonakilty, the recent work, the focus was to, at this end of the scale, try to get this additive benefit between nitrogen fertilizer and clover, to get that added benefit. The focus of the work that we have had at Salahead is there's more of an environmental focus on it, is to try to work at this end of the scale where we can get high output with minimum nitrogen fertilizer input. Of course, the challenge with clover swards with high nitrogen input is to maintain the clover content of the sward, because there tends to be a negative nitrogen fertilizer increases the competitiveness of the grass, which tend to drive the clover out of the sward. And the other thing to take from this slide is this graph is that you can get the same level of output with 0, 60, 120, 180 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. And of course, it's very hard for some people, or I suppose the majority of people, to think about taking nitrogen fertilizer out of the system entirely. And the type of system we've run at Salahead for many years was using 90 kilos nitrogen per hectare, and really moving in this direction has been, it's only to meet the environmental targets that push us in that direction. So we have around 16 years of data. It's a big data set on comparing grass clover with 95 kilos of nitrogen per hectare on average. That ranges from between around 80 and 120, depending on the years. We kind of played around with the numbers. And then using grass only with 245 kilos nitrogen per hectare in the blue. And you can see the annual production averaged over 16 years. Grass clover is higher production. Then you can also see the spread of production on average in terms of growth rates. And what we typically find is no difference in growth rates in the spring up till around this time of the year, mid-April, where the clover can't really sustain the same high output as a fertilizer system during May, during peak growth. And we tend to get some of that production back then in the second half of the year. Now you can say there's a difference in production here, and there is. When we compare the two of these systems, and again, we did an economic analysis, it's published now, we're in the process of doing another one, but it was based on 9 years of data, which showed that there was no economic difference between the two systems, that the clover system may be slightly lower output, but also lower costs in terms of fertilizer nitrogen use. So it can compete economically. The kind of work that we've been doing at the moment, and of course we've been learning all the time, improving our management all the time, and you know, you make plenty of mistakes, you learn as you go along. So if we compare the type of systems we're looking at the moment over the last 4 years, grass only system receiving an average of 272 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, average stock rate 2.55, and you can see the level of output there. Drought year in 2018, maybe lost about 2 tons of production. Our standard grass clover system with 90 kilos of nitrogen, same stocking rate, more or less same output, maybe slightly lower production. And then this grass clover system, which we've been running now, we're into our 3rd year, using no nitrogen fertilizer, similar levels of output. Now, of course, we'll have to run this for a few years to get a full handle on it, but like we're well into the year again now this year, and we're quite, it's kind of surprises me all the time that the system can work as well as it does. So I guess that explains that. Now, a big question, of course, is if you're converting a farm over to clover, how do you go about it? A lot of people are advocating over sowing, which I wouldn't be an advocate of. It's something we've used in the past, but I think for very specific purposes. I think really when you're converting a farm to clover, reseeding has to be a big part of it, particularly under high output. If you're aiming for a high output system, high production system, you really have to be looking at reseeding. And if you want to get into clover quickly, and of course, like you might reseed 5 or 10% of the farm every year, it's going to be 20 years if you're doing 5%. So if you want to accelerate that, means accelerating the rate of reseeding. I think the first thing to do is have a bank of silage built up, maybe from previous years, or even buying in silage. And the other thing to do then is if you're reseeding at the moment, and we're right in the process of reseeding 10% of the farm at Salahead as we speak. It was burnt off last week, and we'll be sowing today or tomorrow. The other thing is fertilizer nitrogen. Those paddocks now reseeded right now, we'll say they'll come into the system late May, early June. So we aim to reseed early so that we have that grass coming back into the system. Wind tend to fall off a bit during June. Growth tends to fall off a bit during June. But those swards will get 2 bags of 10-20 after reseeding. But there's no need to put any fertilizer nitrogen on those for the rest of the year. We get very high output from them. But the fertilizer that can be saved on those clover paddocks can be used elsewhere on the farm. So maybe if you're using, say, 200 units on other paddocks, you could up the rate on that. And generally you get a linear increase in production from those paddocks. So if you some parts of the farm under clover getting no nitrogen, you know, other parts of the farm with an elevated rate of nitrogen fertilizer, and you'll maintain output. The other thing that can be done is paddocks that might have been reseeded in recent years with a good distribution of clover. And distribution is important. You don't want clover in one corner of a field or one quarter of a field. You want a good distribution of clover right throughout the field. And with the right management, you can bring up the clover contents up to productive levels. And the first step in that is low nitrogen fertilizer input. The less nitrogen you put on, the more clover will come into the swards. Tight grazing is very important, down to 3.54 centimeters. And really, when you have clover in the sward, the tighter you graze, the more productive your swards will be. And even if you graze tighter, which is not realistic, you get higher production. We simulated that with cutting. And this is where oversowing can come in. If you already have clover in the sward, it may work to help along that clover by oversowing. So if we had paddocks like that, what we'll do is we'll take them out for first cut silage, aim to get a fairly heavy cut of silage in late May, and then we'll oversow them after first cut silage. And they'll get no nitrogen fertilizer then for the rest of the year. Because if you oversow and didn't put on nitrogen, you're only fighting against yourself. It makes it very difficult for that clover to get established. Now, when you're going to clover, of course, the big risk is bloat. Particularly if you've cows moving from non-clover swards to clover swards. They're not used to clover, the type of system we have in Salahead. Cows go onto the clover system in the spring. The clover content increases from around 10% around now up to maybe 40, maybe even 50% in late July and August. And that's when you have a really big risk of bloat. But because our cows are on it from the spring, they're adapted to it, their digestive system is adapted to it, and we don't really have a problem with bloat at Salahead. But if we're moving cows from non-clover to clover, that's where it can be a real problem, particularly between July and September. You're probably okay. Early in the year, it's not really a problem. Of course, if you're in that situation, you can put bloat oil into the water supply, which will help to avoid bloat. It's also useful to have some oil on hand if you ever have to treat a cow, because even putting bloat oil into the water, cows might under wet conditions might not necessarily drink enough water or take in the bloat oil. The other thing is to avoid hungry cows going into clover swards, or to give them a slow introduction. Maybe allow them in for a couple of hours before releasing them out over the whole paddock, because clovers, when it grows in the paddock, particularly during the peak of clover production during July and August, it's like an umbrella growing on the sward. So when you look down, it looks like there's nothing else there but clover. When you take up a handful of it and look at it from the side, you realize there's a lot of grass in it, because the clover leaf sits on the surface of the sward. So if cows can get in across the sward, they're very hungry, they'll just mop up all the clover. Of course, that clover then that causes the bloating. Whereas if you force them to graze down before leading them out over the sward, they're getting a much better mix of grass and clover. The other thing is to be careful about K and magnesium mineral imbalances. And this is something we've come across, and something that other people have come across as well. Just to be wary of that. And the other thing to avoid bloat is to provide a source of fibre. One of the things we do in Salahead is during July and August, we're building covers for the autumn, really to extend the grazing season. But say July, August, we'll build up the cover of around 1,200 in mid-September. Generally, our covers will start to fall off after that. But building that cover, that heavy cover at that time of the year, there's a bit more fibre in the grass. That helps to avoid bloat. Another way of doing that is just to give the cows access to a bale after milking. Could be a bale of hay, bale of straw, bale of silage, whatever's available. And if cows want fibre, they'll seek it out. But I suppose in terms of converting to clover, this is an obstacle. And like, there's nothing worse than a farmer ringing you up on a Monday morning after losing a couple of cows, and that's a real negative when it comes to converting to clover. The type of seed mixtures that we've been using, these are the mixtures now we used 2 years ago, so they're a bit out of date, but you know, not really when you look at the varieties John was showing earlier on. And I put them up there more as an example rather than a recommendation. The big difference here is we're using 2 varieties. This is the germinal mix. This is the gold crop mix. 5 kilos of 2 perennial ryegrasses in both cases, and 2 kilos of white clover. It's everlasting, is a hybrid clover. It's very like white clover. And I suppose the big difference in our mix is we put in 2 kilos of red clover as well. And we've been doing that for the last 3 years, and we're very happy with it, and we're happy to recommend it. Red clover isn't typically recommended in grazing mixes. It's more for silage, but we found that it gives us a great kick to production in the early years after reseeding. And like when we look at white clover, it's much more persistent, but it'll give us fixation rates of up to 250 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. Red clover, less persistent, but gives us much higher levels of fixation. And then the type of mix that we're using this year, and again, it's experimental. We've increased the rate of red clover to 3 kilos. 3 kilos of 2 perennial ryegrasses, and we're putting a hybrid ryegrass in there as well, which we've been testing over the last few years. We wouldn't be ready to recommend it, but we're happy with it so far. We have to run for a couple of years to really get a good measure. So the idea is that we put the red clover, give us a kick in production for the first 2 to 4 years, and then the white clover and the hybrid clover here is much more persistent in the sward. That'll maintain the sward over the longer term. Maybe we'll have to go in oversow with clover during the in-between if the clover starts to die out. What we hope to do is to reseed at a 10-year interval, so we're reseeding 10% of the farm every year. Maybe have to oversow at some point in between that reseeding. I get a lot of questions about oversowing. We've tried a lot of different techniques in Salahead. The system that we've used and continue to use, the one that we consistently use, is simply mixing the seed with fertilizer and applying it onto the sward. It's very cheap. Most people have a fertilizer spreader. It's no hassle. Because the reality about it is, it's not so much how you deliver the seed to the soil. It's not what you do before oversowing that's important. What's really important is what you how you manage it after oversowing. And really, it's really just common sense that, say, when you're introducing a seed into a growing sward, which is of course a very competitive environment, it's important that the seed can come in contact with the soil. So it needs to be going onto a bare open sward. So generally what we do is we'll let a field on for first cut silage. We'll take a fairly heavy cut, which tends to thin out the sward, plenty of bare ground. In Salahead, it's a relatively wet farm. Moist soil conditions are generally not a problem. We'll apply 2 kilos per acre of seed, and the fertilizer is purely a carrier, so there's no nitrogen in it. Normally we use something like 0730. And we apply dirty water slurry after putting on the seed, and that's it. We don't do anything else. The key then, of course, is to allow plenty light down to the seedlings to give them a chance to establish. And this will work for white clover. It doesn't work for red clover. If you're putting in red clover, that only goes in the reseed. Because white clover is adapted to colonizing grassland. So it's adapted to make its way. And what you'll find is, if you keep the swards well grazed down, so we'd be talking about initially grazing, pre-grazing covers of maybe 800, maybe up to 1,000 as time goes on. You'll see the seedlings coming into the sward. So tight grazing is important, and if you continue to graze tight for the first part, for the remainder of the grazing season, you'll get a good distribution by the end of the year. I also recommend maintaining a low cover over the winter. So really, for successful oversowing, no nitrogen fertilizer. As I said, use the fertilizer in other parts of the farm, tight grazing. And like when you're building covers for the autumn, it's important to short circuit back onto the swards that are oversown, and make sure that you don't let covers build up, because the covers are going, if you let covers build up, you're going to kill out the clover. So that's as much as I'm going to say about clover. Just to kind of wrap it up in terms of the future, I talked about population densities and global population and where that's going. This is the UN prediction for where the global population is going to go, and it's as I said, it's doubled in my lifetime. It may well go up by the same amount again in my lifetime if I live long enough. And really, it's not a case that there are more people being born, because the birth rate globally is more or less stabilized. It's that the people that are there already are getting older, and that's what's going to give us the big increase before we start maybe seeing a reduction in the global population. Really, if we look forward for the next 50 years, we're talking about increasing demand for food, increasing demand to feed people. Of course, it asks other questions about energy. That was more of a concern, say, in the 70s than it is today, where we've got a lot of different alternatives, like wind energy, for example, and photovoltaic. Water could become a big issue. Certain parts of the world, water is already becoming scarce. Can we feed the population? That's a big question. Question around fertilizers, say P and K in particular. There's limited resources or finite resources of these on the planet. And then, of course, is the big question of the greenhouse effect and what impact that's likely to have over the next 50 years. The other thing is to look at global wealth. If we look at, say, 1967, you can see the distribution of different populations here on this map. More than half of the world's population were living in extreme poverty back in 1967, and most of the wealthy people were concentrated here in Europe and North America. And if we look at the situation recently, in recent years, we can see that there's been a massive shift in global population. And the average income in Ireland in 1967, for example, is now the equivalent of the global average. So there's a huge increase in wealth and a huge increase in capacity. And of course, that's also driving climate change, in that these people are becoming more wealthy. They've got greater demands. When we look at the number of people living in extreme poverty, it's down 10%. When we look at it in terms of actual numbers, there's half the number of people living in extreme poverty today than there was back in 1967. So there's been massive improvements. And of course, this is also a massive opportunity in terms of the quality of the food and that these people will demand as time goes on. So just to finish up, I've used the slides for different things, and I put different numbers here over the last 2 years. One point was 30%, then it's 10%, then it's 15%. Now it's back up again. The government are looking for a 55% reduction across the economy by 2030. I don't know what the emission reduction target they're looking for from agriculture. and I've really given up on trying to figure that one out. But it seems that we'll be told that figure at some point. On the other hand, there's growing demand for high quality and safe food over the next 50 years. I think safe food becoming increasingly important. And the Paris Agreement was concerned with climate change. But one of the statements in that agreement was the need for sustainable intensification of food production, and that's really what we're aiming at Salahead, trying to increase our food production while lowering our footprint. And low emission slurry spreading, clover and protected urea are all things that lower emissions from dairy farms. And at Salahead, as I said, we have a high stock system with low environmental footprint, not only in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and ammonia, but also water quality. We've no real problem with water quality on the farm in Salahead. And of course, marketing opportunities. I think this will be increasingly important. There will be marketing opportunities for food with low environmental footprints. So that's my presentation. So I'll stop sharing. Okay.
Thanks very much, James. We'll open the floor to a few more questions there. I have a couple coming through here. John Mack has answered a few there, but we'll just run through them quickly. Can John or James explain the difference between a diploid and a tetraploid grass?
I'd say let a proper scientist explain that rather than a half a scientist.
Thanks, John. So the biological difference is where each organism, including ourselves, have a number of chromosomes. I don't know I can't remember what the figure is for grass, but in humans it's 23 chromosomes. And you've got pairs of chromosomes, so 2 pairs. You get 1 pair from your mother and the other pair from your father. Or you get 1 set from your mother, 1 set from your father, and you get a pair, and that's your genetic makeup. Tetraploid is where different means it can happen by accident in nature, but also you could maybe irradiate it or use different chemicals to double the number of chromosomes. So instead of being a diploid, which is 2 pairs, you're a tetraploid, which means you have 4 pairs of chromosomes. So it changes the biology of the plant, and often when you have 4 pairs of chromosomes like that, you can enhance some of the features of the grass. Now that's a biological explanation. I don't know if that's really what the question was about. From a practical point of view, or from a phenotype point of view, it means that tetraploids generally tend to be more open, and they tend to be more digestible. That's the impact of that. And it's just a breeding technique. It's just a way of generating new varieties by doubling the chromosome number. In some cases, in different barley crops, for example, you could have 6 pairs of chromosomes. No, 3 pairs.
Thanks, James. Either panelists can answer this as well. What is the recommended time to be allowed between spraying and power harrowing, or between spraying off a field and plowing?
Will I say what I said on the type thing, Gavin?
Yeah, Jenny, we'll just give a quick
I better
answer.
be consistent. I'm presuming who's asking that they're talking about burning off, so that's with a glyphosate brackets, you know, a Roundup type product, or there's various other alternatives to Roundup out there. And as I was saying in the thing, you want your grass and your weeds growing actively. There's times where I've even suggested giving it a small bit of nitrogen before you spray it. So you want it growing actively. The more active it's grown, the better the uptake of the spray. You want plenty leaf there. I notice people get into the habit of grazing the field first and then spraying it, or cutting it for silage first and waiting to let it come back. You're reducing the amount of leaf that's available to take the spray if you do that. You want a good amount of leaf there. The more leaf you have, the better the spray uptake. The spray then gets transmitted down to the root, and as the root of the dock or the grass or the weed starts dying off, you'll see the effect up on the grass itself. Grass will start going first, dock will go last because it is a big taproot. And I always call it, it depends how many generations of docks, whether it's this generation or to the grandfather dock. If it's a grandfather dock, it could have a root as big as our plantain or our chicory or a small sugar beet. So it needs more spray and it needs more time to wither away. So the more time you can give it, the better. But if you had a pure grass sward and you were burning it off, often you'll see it turn in as short as 5 days. A recommendation probably is don't do anything with it for 7 days. But the longer you can wait, generally the better.
Perfect, thanks, John. I suppose the big question, and it's kind of a question from many farmers out there, post-mortem sprays, weed control program put in place for clover. There's no real, well, there isn't a clover safe spray in the market at this moment in time. I suppose John or James, you might make a comment on that, please.
I'm not qualified enough, James.
So yeah, it's a real big problem. I think it's myself in trouble now, but it's a case of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing in terms of insisting that irrigation farmers put in clover and then remove the only clover safe option. That's so in Salahid, we stocked up with DB Plus, which is the Legamex type product there last year, so we can continue to use that until the end of this year. And outside of that, then you're very limited if you use a lot of the other sprays, pasture type sprays. They're not clover safe. They'll kill the clover. And some of the options that people consider maybe just putting in grass only and spraying, and then putting in the clover subsequently. So you're very limited. And I guess, yeah.
Gavin, you had some information before we came on air tonight, which was giving us a bit more hope. Without mentioning products, like you had a bit of information, we'll say, hot off the press.
Yeah, John, I suppose there's talks of a derogation for the clover safe spray. So we're hoping that I've been told Michael Donovan in more part that it's on the minister's desk to be signed. So look, I wouldn't be quoting me in that now, but look, there's some hopeful news out there anyway. So we'll be hoping to have that, but look, there's no guarantee with it, and I could imagine stocks would be quite limited as well. But look, we can keep the fingers crossed and that side.
Just on that, if we have people listening, that bit of information is making me a bit braver to say, if you're sitting now at the moment, put in your clover, and hopefully when we need to spray it in 4 weeks' time, that'll be sorted. At the very worst, if it isn't sorted and your field is riddled with weeds, you'll have to use a non-clover spray. It'll have costed the cost of the clover, and then you'll have to top seed again next August when the spray you used, when its residual effect has wore off. In the last couple of days, and after hearing that, I'm reverting to saying put in the clover, and let's hope to God we have the derogation in by the time we need to spray it in 4 weeks' time. But I could be all wrong, lads. I could be all wrong.
Just to comment on that, maybe James, 12 weeks, I suppose there's a residual effect of 12 weeks on the spray. Is 12 weeks after spraying too late? Would you be better off leaving until the following spring to go with it, or is it too late to be going with it in autumn to try establish clover?
I think it's not ideal. It's certainly not ideal to be going after 3 months. Yeah, it's not. It's an option, and it will be easier to oversow into an existing sward. After 3 months, and but it's not a good option relative to, say, being able to use something like Legamex. The other thing is that I'd be recommending reseeding at this time of the year, and trying to get that grass back into the rotation by late May, dip in production in June. I wouldn't be in favor of autumn reseeding. I think reseeding, 2 real options are now, or reseed late June, have that grass coming back into the rotation in September. The other option then, say, we could talk about is Eagle, which is not licensed for use on reseeds. It's only licensed for use in grassland that's 1 year old. And Eagle itself isn't. It's a pretty useless herbicide for mature docks. It doesn't kill them very well. But I think if you get the docks young enough with Eagle, it can work reasonably well. Say, for example, if you put in a reseed in the autumn, maybe got out with it in the following year.
Perfect. It's just to keep an eye on it, and if there is an update on that Clover Safe spray, as soon as we know, we can let people know. Just a few more questions coming through there as well. Again, for you, James, how long are you finding clover lasts in the sward, and what's the best way to rejuvenate clover in an established sward?
So, like, that's the real big challenge. If you go back, and I suppose when we started the clover work back in Salahead in 2000, that was the big challenge. It remains a challenge, but we started at that time. We said we do it if we were allowed to continue to work for 12 years, because a lot of the earlier work had been done for maybe 3 years, 4 years, and then it was phased out and people moved on to other things. And during that 12 years, and I showed 16 years of data there, we were able to maintain the clover without any great difficulty. It's only a matter of putting in the right management, and we've been able to improve that management over time. And nitrogen fertilizer use, how you manage nitrogen fertilizer is absolute key. Low nitrogen fertilizer, and the lower the better. And like when we're running the 3 systems in simple terms at the moment that I showed at the moment, with fertilizer nitrogen in 1, grass clover with some fertilizer in the spring, and grass clover with no fertilizer, and we're seeing very little difference in growth rates again this year. It gives us more confidence, but the less nitrogen fertilizer you use, the more competitive your clover will be in the sward. You'll push up the clover contents. If we say where we're using 90 kilos of nitrogen, we'll have around 20-25% on average in the sward over the course of the year. We take nitrogen out of the equation, or very low nitrogen, we can push that up to 30%, and that's giving us higher fixation then as a consequence. The more nitrogen you put on, the less fixation you get. The less nitrogen you put on, you get the more fixation you can get. And clover can be quite competitive. So in terms of maintaining clover, number 1, low nitrogen, tight grazing is absolutely vital. It suits the clover down to the ground. The work that we're doing at the moment is looking at winter covers. We've some strong evidence to say that low covers over the winter is beneficial to clover. We've some other evidence to say that maybe it doesn't have such an effect. So we're really doing a control study on that. But in general, during the winter, spring, low covers to help the clover because it's not as competitive at that time of the year. The second half of the year, say from June through to October, clover tends to be dominant in the sward, so long rotations at that time of the year. They're the key management, and then the last thing then is oversowing, which can be used to like if clover starts to die out, you just go in and oversow, as I described there.
Perfect. We just take one more question. I'm just conscious of time now. We're after running this 9:45. Just one last question. What is the plan for reseeding if glyphosate is banned? And also, could John just have touch on the multi-species swards again, and just comment on how the clover established within that sward?
Yeah, James, I started, but I'll pull you in the sense my experience with the multi-species is very limited. It's really effectively only one that was set in Shinnock last year as part of the carbon or Farum 0C. It came very well. It was a clean field that was picked as regards the question about weed control. Obviously, it got no weed spray afterwards because whatever about the clover, I'm not sure there's anything out there that won't wipe out chicory and plantain. I give credit. Okay, I suppose I should give credit to 2 things. 1, because there was more clover, kilos went in, helped. 2, because of the plantain and the chicory, the sward was more open afterwards, and it gave a chance for the clover to come. So it did come very well. Just on the glyphosate thing, I suppose long before glyphosate, there was very good ploughmen, and are we going to be forced back to good ploughmen, making sure with good skim boards? And what are the other bits? I have all the words of it forgotten about ploughing, you know, that you're burying it down and you have nothing, you have no ribbons of grass sticking up. Is that what we're back to? James, maybe comment on both aspects, James, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, I'd agree with if the glyphosate goes and there's a real risk, we'll be back to ploughing. And the second thing is the reason we've stayed away from multi-species is because of not being able to use. You can't really use any post-emergence herbicide on it. And like where ducks get into a field and they get out of control, you could be back reseeding. You know, they can completely dominate the sward, and we've measured this after 4 or 5 years. Might have much of a problem in the first few years. So that's kind of why we kind of stayed away from the multi-species. But if it becomes that we've no choice in terms of herbicide use, we might have to consider it. And in terms of like the crossover between, say, multi-species and clover-based systems, they're very similar in terms of productivity. Okay, you're putting the chicory and plantain in there, but production-wise, it's been driven by the clover content, and in terms of their environmental impact, it's very similar. So there's you know, it's not a big difference between the two.
Yeah, and James, yeah. I would totally agree with you. If it's the clover and the grass that's driving the sward, and the other things may not last, they're in there, they're not doing any harm except from the graze. And we're not measuring, you know, we're measuring relative to other paddocks. I would totally defer to you. This is about getting enough clover in.
Yeah, clover, well, for me, clover is the key, and even say in the kind of mixtures I talked about, 2 kilos of white clover, 3 kilos of red clover, 2 or 3 kilos of red clover. Red clover is very small seed, but it's a lot of clover going into the system to drive it, as I said.
Sorry, Gavin, it's something that James said before to us. I think the red clover might be crucial because, James, I think you said it tonight, red clover is capable of adding 300 kilos of nitrogen per hectare in the first couple of years. That could be the way of getting over the cold turkey of having, there's a number of drug addicts or recovering drug addicts on the call tonight, so they'll understand this, same as myself. You know, going from we have become addicted to nitrogen, and grass has become addicted to nitrogen, and there is, James, at least a 2-year sort of getting used to the new thing. So the red clover might be, I think, from listening to you and our own limited experience, could be vital to bridging the gap between 300 kilos of nitrogen to the hectare and 90.
Yeah, we're certainly growing more grass now than we were before, and I think red clover is a part of that. And like if we're growing 14-15 tons of grass with clover-based system, no nitrogen, that nitrogen is coming from somewhere. It's you know, you won't run the system. The nitrogen has to come from somewhere.
That's perfect. I'm just conscious of small between work there. It is nearly 10 to 10 now, so we might wrap it up there. I just, on behalf of the COP, would like to thank the 3 speakers, James, Rachel, and John. If there is any questions we didn't get around to, I suppose, or if there's anything to get about it, you can contact myself, Rachel, or John, and we can ask the questions to James as well. Just before we go, our webinar will be available. It's recorded, so it will be up on our website there at the start of next week, along with other ones. So, yeah, I suppose we'll just call it a night, and just like to thank everybody again, and thanks everybody for attending.
Gavin, can you edit out some of my indiscreet comments before you put it up on the public, please? Thank you.
I can, of course, Jan. No worries, no worries.
Thanks, Gavin.
Thanks very much.